What's going on, fellas? This is questions number 44, where you guys ask me any training, conditioning, strength, sport related questions you may have, and I at least give you my opinion on them. I don't like calling these Q&As because it's not answers, it's my opinion. But just got back from getting a mattress today, moving into the house on Tuesday. Very, very excited about that, but super busy. Trying to hold myself accountable for still making a video, even though today is my off day for client work. I'm really trying to stay on top of it because in a perfect world, I diversify my income and I make enough money off the YouTube videos that I can have a few less clients and do a better job for my clients. I think that would be very nice. So that's really what I'm working towards and what's motivating me to try to stay on top of making these videos, because then I can do these, which I enjoy, and do a better job for my clients while keeping my prices low and still be able to afford my portion of the mortgage payment. Sounds great. So if you guys have any questions you would like my answer to, the easiest way to do it is I'm going to put up a community post asking for questions probably a day or two before I do the next one. Leave your question there. It's kind of hard to find comments sometimes if you leave them in the comments of these videos, because there's a bunch of other comments discussing maybe things I talked about. So finding those kind of difficult to do, especially while making a video. So save your questions for the community post I will put before I make the next one. Got a bunch of good questions today, lots of technical ones, which I love. I love just talking like nitty gritty nuts and bolts training stuff, speculating about why things may work. Really enjoy that stuff. So these are my favorite videos to do. The first one is worst program you've ever ran. I can't say I've ever run a bad program because the number of programs that I have followed as they're written is maybe one, and I don't think I followed it as written. I've always liked doing my own program. I've always liked tinkering with things. So I can't say I've run very many programs. I did 5x5s early in my training, but it wasn't starting strength 5x5 because I did a shit ton of bodybuilding accessory work, which I'm very glad I did. Later on, I did run Smolov Junior as a progression for my bench, but again, that's not a program because I was doing my own accessories. I was just using that as a progression scheme within my own program, and that worked quite well for me. I think that unless you have a reasonably efficient technique, you might not be able to pull that off. It'll bang you up. You can also run it at a little bit lower frequency. I think that calls for like 4 times a week, but you could just run 2 a week and follow that progression scheme, and that worked okay for me. It's a solid progression scheme that I got good results from. I think that I'm not endorsing Smolov or Smolov Junior necessarily, because I think that only works for a small subsect of lifters who are smaller lifters, who are a little bit more advanced. They've got that big work capacity built up. They've got very mechanically efficient motion. Then they might benefit from a very high volume program like that. But on the other side of the coin, if you're not very efficient, you're newer to lifting, it might be a really bad suggestion. So definitely not endorsing it, but it worked for me to run Smolov Junior on my bench at the time. And then a little bit later on, I ran the Juggernaut method. And I recall not getting the best results in the world from it, but I have a very bad memory. So I'm more than likely, I like the Juggernaut method on paper. I think it works for a lot of people quite well. So I'm gonna go out on a limb and guess I was doing something wrong. So it wasn't an issue with the program, and it wasn't even that the program didn't work for me. It's that I didn't execute the program properly. I have no idea what I was doing, but I have solid hunch that's what happened. I just don't remember because this was many years ago. And unlike Max, I do not have an encyclopedic memory for my own training endeavors. The next one is, what's your thoughts on step loading? Will you guys let me know, did some popular YouTuber talk about step loading recently? Was it the Squat Everyday guy? Because for the longest time, I've been lifting weights. I've been involved in the fitness community online. I've been learning everything, and I never heard anyone talk about step loading in particular. Almost because it's just kind of an implied progression scheme. I didn't hear people talk about it outright at all. And then just a couple months ago, everyone's asking me about step loading all the time. I think it's totally appropriate. I think that it might not always be the best. I think people will hold back their rate of progression when compared to a more traditional periodization scheme. But for accessory work, I think step loading is very appropriate, right? We build reps and we build quality until that working weight is maybe a little bit insufficient, and then we move up. It doesn't always have to be super aggressive, beat the books, one more rep than last week, or die trying. I think some accessories, if you do that, you're just gonna deteriorate your form, and you're gonna lose some of the purpose of the exercise. So oftentimes I'll see people go crazy with beat the books pull downs. And yes, you're getting one more rep each week, but you're no longer executing it in a manner that's necessarily what we're looking for. And then you'd be better off actually progressing a little bit slower. So I think step loading can very much have its place. Just confused why it's suddenly suddenly a big thing. But it's great. I know that I will implement step loading as my go-to progression scheme for some motions within my program at all times. So I would say that I can't say anything bad about it because it's omnipresent in my my own programming. The next one is recovering from a back injury by Mac Smithy. I'm sorry, man. I'm not a physical therapist. Without knowing any specifics, it's really unethical of me to tell you, oh, just do this, you'll get better based on my anecdotal experiences. A, I'm not a professional. B, there's probably some amount of liability there. But me saving my own skin aside, it's without knowing anything more, I couldn't even give you a recommendation that I have any confidence in. What if I tell you something and it makes it worse? Then I feel quite bad. So I really can't give you guys specifics on injuries. It's not something I'm qualified to do. The next one is, should we focus on hypertrophy, strength, or both? So if your goal is strength, focusing on some hypertrophy is absolutely going to be necessary, right? To maximize our strength, one of the biggest predictors of strength is the cross-sectional muscle of an area. So by nature, you're going to be focusing on hypertrophy. And on the other side of the coin, achieving progressive overload with time is central to seeing hypertrophy. So these things aren't entirely separable. Optimal training for hypertrophy and optimal training for optimal training for hypertrophy and optimal training for strength, they look a little bit different, but there's a lot more intersect and overlap than there is difference. So what I would tell you is that just depends on your goals. If your goals skew a little bit towards one, that's how you should train. If your goals skew a little bit towards the other, that's what you train. I can't tell you what I think you should do because that just depends on what you want to do. If you want to be a strong guy, then maybe bias your training a little bit more towards strength. If you want to be a big guy or you want to look a certain way, bias your training towards how you want to look, right? I certainly cannot tell you that for you. The next one is, how would you balance daily running with a strength training program? Well, if you are not heavy, it's not the hardest thing in the world. If you're heavy, impact-based cardio can be a little bit tricky, but I'm going to assume you're around an average body weight, in which case, I did this. Sorry about that, camera died. If I recall correctly as to where that cut me off, I believe I was saying that as long as you're not particularly heavy and as long as your running form is relatively efficient, then more than likely, as far as incorporating running into our lifting routine or just having a holistic fitness routine, we're not going to have to worry about kind of localized stress at maybe the ankles, the knees, and the hips like we might need to if we were heavy or if we had inefficient running form. So if we're not looking at kind of localized stressors at the joints, we're looking mostly at kind of global fatigue. So kind of going in order as to how to write yourself up a routine. The number of times you strength train compared to the number of times you run should be relative to your goals. So if you'd rather being in good shape is more important to you than being strong, then maybe a few more running sessions than we do lifting sessions or vice versa. So we find the number that are dependent on your goals. You trial and error and you find when you like running, when you feel it impacts your training the least, whether you like running before training, in the morning, like whether you like running after training, whether you like running on your rest days from the gym or on the same day and then taking some real rest. So you just trial and error those things. And basically, as long as both are present in the program, you get to just trial and error and see, okay, well, based on my current recovery capabilities, how much I'm sleeping, how much I'm eating, so on, and how good a shape I'm in, I can do about this much total work, which equates to this many running sessions and this much volume in the gym. So kind of picking out those variables as we talked about, like the number of sessions, when in the week you do each session, when in the day you do each session, and then it comes down to trial and error for how much volume you do, how far you run, or how many basically working sets you do in the gym, and those things have to mesh. So if you're going to increase one temporarily, you might need to decrease the other, but finding what your maximum recoverable volume for the two of those things would be how you would go about it. The next one, thank you, Tushar, for the billion really good questions. A lot of fun. Really like these kind of technical questions. So the first one is, why do you think deadlifts are more taxing than squats? Is it because the absolute load tends to be heavier? Deadlifts lack eccentric loading before the concentric phase, or some other reason? So both of those things are going to contribute, right? Obviously, right, the deadlift for most people is going to be heavier than the squat. That's going to lead to some amount of fatigue that's probably more than the squat. Two, right, the lack of perfect positioning by having a loaded eccentric, right? We could argue, well, isn't the deadlift less taxing on a set-to-set basis because we don't have half of the lift in there if we're not controlling our negatives? An anecdotal experience will tell me that's not necessarily the case. They are still more taxing for most people. And I'd say that's absolutely part of it, is the difficulty to become technically proficient in the deadlift can sometimes be harder because we have to find a position rather than just control weight down into a position, and it kind of sorts itself out for us. But the other thing that's going to contribute heavily is if central nervous system fatigue, right? We can argue about whether that's a real thing, or if that is a real thing, the degree to which that's the right name for it, but like global fatigue, feeling tired, right? I can tell you anecdotally and observationally through coaching that things that are like axially taxing, so things that load the muscles surrounding your spinal column, have more of an impact on that kind of systemic fatigue than things that aren't really loaded axially. Even if the weights are equated, right? We could be doing a really heavy leg press, and generally speaking, because that's not axially loading, it doesn't tend to be as globally, holistically fatiguing. So I'd say that because the deadlift loads the lower back, the spine, probably more than any other lift with a pretty significant amount of weight. That's part of why it's so taxing. And then the other thing that's kind of important is on a straight bar deadlift, it's inherently impossible to get the bar center of mass of the weights over the center mass of your body. So it's always going to be pulling you forward. It's always going to have a little bit more leverage as far as like the lever length, as far as how much stress it's putting on your spine, attempting to round you over. It's always in front of you. You're always fighting that. Whereas in a squat, that impulse is going to be less because we're able to place that center of mass directly over like our midfoot. So I'd say that's also part of it. This is just speculation though. Those would be my guesses. It's not something we ever covered in school in my like exercise physiology classes. At no point was that mentioned. I think maybe they mentioned the axially loaded exercise is more fatiguing, but it's totally possible they never mentioned that. So that would be my guess. The next one is to build squat, is higher rep deadlifts not a good option? I'm following a program which requires 4 sets of squats, deads, bench in the 8 to 12 rep range, with the last set being an AMRAP to a rep goal. I always exceed that goal by 1 or 2 reps, maybe more on the squat, but the deadlift I come up short by 1 to 3 reps. Basically, he goes, before my lower back gives up. Sorry for the long post, but I would like to hear your thoughts. That's a great question. Generally speaking, right, again, this is not based on some physiological principle that I'm trying to like impart on you guys. This is just my experience. I do not think that higher rep conventional deadlifting, or sumo deadlifting for that matter, deadlifting from the floor, is a tremendously good use of time. It's very, very fatiguing. Because of that axial loading that we talked about potentially, and it's just not the best use of training economy. From a hypertrophy perspective, if we're going to be doing something in the 8 to 12 rep range for our posterior chain and lower back, something that kind of is a better stimulus to fatigue ratio would be an RDL. Generally speaking, those are going to be just a little bit less taxing by removing that initial off the floor part. We get to keep some constant tension. We have an eccentric to get us down into a nice efficient position. If we're going to be doing hip hinging in that 8 to 12 range, I don't think dead stop pulls from the floor are going to be the move. I don't think that's tremendously effective training for strength, because obviously we have hypertrophy phases for strength, but generally speaking, if you're deadlifting for the 8 to 12 rep range, you're going to be drilling pretty poor motor patterns by the time you're under any significant fatigue. So we're kind of practicing the wrong skill there. It would be better to do maybe 2 or 3 sets of submaximal sets of 5 with the same weight. So we do a little bit more total volume. Each set is easier, so we can drill good form and then go use that extra energy that we saved on our accessory work that's focused on hypertrophy. So I just don't think it's something that I would ever really include in a program for the most part. Yeah, and from a hypertrophy perspective, I just think that that would be way more taxing than it needs to be to get effectively the same gains you would get out of a similar set of RDLs. The next question is, my normal bench grip is slightly wider than shoulder width and my sticking point is near lockout. However, when I do close grip, I feel more explosive off the chest and just stronger overall. What could this mean? I would imagine my close grip bench to feel worse if my triceps were the limiting factor on a normal bench. This is a great question. More often than not, when we're missing really high in a lift, it's not necessarily always a tricep strength issue. If it was, triceps are active through the whole bench. They don't just activate at lockout. That it's a little bit overly simplistic. More often than not, people I see missing high in the bench, it's because they compromise their positioning as far as like their tightness and their positions to get it moving off the chest, and then it catches up to you higher in the lift when you're not necessarily as tight as you would have been if you had better strength in the bottom, right? So working on our back tightness in the very bottom range of motion, focusing on maintaining tension during the pause, not kind of heaving it out of the pause. Those things can be very helpful. As far as feeling more explosive on a closer grip bench, super normal. That's just kind of innate to the motion. Speaking generally, I don't think that's necessarily like that means your triceps are strong. I don't think that means they're weak. That motion just tends to be a little bit more, it goes faster, it doesn't go. Yeah, so I would tell you that it more than likely what this all means is not that your triceps are weak and that's why you're missing high in the bench. It's that you're compromising your tightness and your positioning at the bottom of the bench to get the weight moving, and that's manifesting as a issue higher up in the lift. Lots of people are familiar with this idea on the deadlift. If you're having a lockout issue, more often than not, it's not that you're struggling to get your hips through. Mechanically, that's a much easier position than the bottom. It's that you rounded your back to get it off the floor, and then at the top of the lift, you're having to unround your back. Can be kind of similar on a bench press. So that would be my best shot at an answer. The next one is, how do you determine what the appropriate number of sets should be per week or per training session for each lift? For example, if I'm designing a strength block and you're benching 2x per week, how do you tell if it's better to do 3x5 on each day or 5x5? Does number of sets matter, or is it total volume within a given rep range that's most important? I like to think about things as number of sets kind of within a loading parameter. So I'd say, generally speaking, if we follow a framework that I like to follow, and there's nothing magical about this, which is like, let's say we're in a hypertrophy range, we're training 6 to 10 reps, 6 to 12 reps. Generally speaking, it's going to be better rather than doing one really hard set of 8 or 10 and drilling bad patterns early in the block. It's better to probably leave about 3 reps in the tank and do 3 or 4 sets. That way we're accumulating more volume and we're drilling better patterns across that volume. So that way we have built a technical, not just a hypertrophy foundation for that training cycle. So basically you come in with that idea of, okay, I have this rep range of probably 6 to 10 on my main lift, and I know that I should be about 3 reps away from failure, and then you kind of feel out what you can recover from in a week. It doesn't have to be right up at your MRV, because the problem with hanging out right at your MRV with your powerlifting work is then if you get held long at work or you have a bad night of sleep, suddenly what was coasting along right below your MRV is actually above it, and you over accumulate fatigue and you might have to take a deload. So giving yourself that little bit of wiggle room for life to happen is okay, but we basically feel out like we have this loading parameter. We try to do a certain number of sets, but hey, I recover that from really easily. I'll add 1 to each session. I like splitting my volume pretty evenly. Same thing applies to approaching a strength training block, as you talked about. We have a general idea of like, hey, most of our working sets, maybe we introduce some very submaximal singles for technique work to get us ready for the peak, but the main work of this phase is going to be roughly the 4 to 6 rep range and roughly 1 to 2 reps in reserve at all times. Leaning towards 2 most of the time for a strength phase, unless someone's on a little bit on the weaker side. So then again, you come in with that principle and you kind of feel out, okay, well, I am hitting my RPE 7 roughly. I'm doing this main lift. How many of these do I feel is productive? Because there's probably an amount you can do that's past the amount that's productive. It's just extra fatiguing for not a whole lot of benefit. So where do we get to that point of marginal returns for how many sets of 5 we're doing? Again, you kind of feel that out. You're like, I really didn't feel like I got much out of the last 3 sets, so next week I'll do 3 less total sets, so on and so forth. Again, it comes down to trial and error, but that's the best insight I can give you as far as the thought process. The next one is, this might be a cold or hot take question, but in a Instagram story from Mike Tusher, who everybody knows is my favorite coach, he said that it's very good to get lost. It's very good to get lost in training habits, doing X because Y used to work. And he followed that up with something along the lines of, because something has worked in the past, it will have a good chance of working again, but you can't assume that'll be the case. Training data has a shelf life. We have to stay on top of it to make sure our training is maximally effective. Would like to know your opinion on this take, because you've mentioned that you enjoy repeating something if it works with small changes and tweaks. Thank you, Sam. Sorry for the long ass question. That's a great question, right? So this idea is just because something has worked in the past, maybe addressed a deficiency at that point in time, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to bring you over the plateau you're at now, because it could be for a totally different reason. And he's saying that it is good information. It does indicate that it might work, but it doesn't guarantee it. And he's also saying that the further away in the past the solution was, likely the less good evidence it is that it'll work, right? So I have a big thing of training journals in my room, right? And if I look at my most recent training journal, which is probably from about 6 months ago, as opposed to my current one, before I moved to it, and I go and I look at roughly what was the approach I was taking for, let's say, a successful squat block. That general approach is pretty likely to get me over, let's say, my current squat plateau, right? Whereas if I get one from the bottom of the box and found what gave me a good squat cycle 2 years ago, the chance that that rough guide of training, that volume, those accessories are going to be helpful for me is going down quite a bit. The chance is actually quite low at that point when you've changed a lot as a lifter. So that's what I would tell you, right, is basing it off of last block can inform a lot of what we're doing, maybe with some small tweaks like you mentioned that I like, but looking really far in the past, like, oh, well, my bench sucked and I did 300 reps of triceps every workout and then my bench got better. Okay, probably if you're not a beginner anymore, you're not going to be able to do that, right? That's not going to work anymore. That was specific to you at the time and it addressed the deficiency at the time. The chance that that's exactly what you need to do right now, maybe once you've moved to intermediate advanced lifter, it's very, very low. So I think that's the gist of it. I agree with everything there. Training data has a shelf life. So it's like after a while that becomes a lot less relevant, but the stuff that's within the shelf life is very good information for us. So I would say I agree with literally everything about that. And it's a lot better way of phrasing that than I could ever do. My T always has some very eloquent ones. I'll just share it with you guys while I'm here. One of them that I like is he was like, you can't force adaptation. You can't just get super psyched up and expect to be stronger than next week by making yourself. Your body does not adapt in that manner, and usually forcing progression ends up getting you hurt or just deteriorating your movement quality. Instead, what we have to think about is it's more like a garden, right? You cannot force the plants to grow, but what you can do is create an environment that's conducive to growth. So we create an environment where we're sleeping a lot, so we have a lot of time to make adaptations. We create an environment where we have all of the resources our body might need to make the adaptations, right? So let's say we're getting a good small calorie surplus with a wide variety of micronutrients, right? Sorry about that. I'm guessing my girlfriend just got out of the bath and is now draining all of the water right above my head. So you're gonna have to ignore that, but we can create an environment that's conducive to it, right? So we get the sleep. That's it. That basically just makes it so our body is in a state where it's more receptive to the idea of growth. We create a calorie surplus. We have a good amount of micronutrients, good amount of macronutrients. Again, creates a state where our body is more likely to make adaptations. And then training is the same way. We're going to present our body with roughly a workload that's not so much that we're dying, and it's not so little that it's not going to drive adaptation. We're just trying to hang out in that range that is creating an environment that is conducive to getting stronger. Yeah, just thought I might share that. God, that is annoying. But I really don't want to redo this whole video, so hopefully it's not too annoying for you guys. Any tips to avoid low back tightness / fatigue from arching on the bench? My lower back is always super tight after benching, and it affects squats and deadlifts despite trying to stretch it out. Do you recommend I arch less on bench, especially on back downs, to avoid excess fatigue during hypertrophy blocks? So a lot of people might use a Larson press in this scenario, but I think there are some other interventions you might be able to make. So the first one is being deliberate about the second you unrack to the second you re-rack, flexing your glutes, right? That can be quite helpful. The couch stretch, if you want to look it up, it's basically a rear foot elevated hip flexor stretch. Always before I bench, makes me feel my back way less the next day. So always doing the couch stretch before I bench, especially if you're someone who benches heels up. Definitely very exaggerated if you do heels up. Flexing the glutes, making sure that instead of jamming ourselves into an arch by using our legs to wedge ourselves into position, we use our spinal erectors, our lats, to pull ourselves into an arch. Because generally speaking, if you wedge a joint into a position, the chance that you're in pain the next day is quite a bit higher than if you use the antagonistic muscle to pull yourself into that position. So we're drawing our chest upward and we're pulling ourselves into an active arch rather than wedging ourselves into a passive arch. I'd say the combination of those three things, as long as I do all of those, my back feels way better and it doesn't necessarily impact my training nearly as much. The next one is first time commenter. Really enjoy your videos. Keep it up. Thank you. Your thoughts on hitting one submaximal bench and squat set at the beginning of every workout, 6 times a week for me. I've been hitting one set of 4 at around RPE 8 for both of these movements for a couple months now. The bench went from 190 to 215 at the same RPE. I'm a beginner, so that's probably why I'm seeing such fast progress, but I'd like to know your thoughts. If you're going to be doing the lift 6 times a week, they need to have technique days, right? So I don't think for almost anyone it's productive to truly train a lift 6 times a week, right? Like working hard enough that that individual session will drive adaptation. If we never have time to recover, we're not going to see significant adaptation, right? Because doing some damage in the gym, exposing our central nervous system to loads is part of the adaptive process, but also recovery back to baseline and hopefully seeing a little bit of super compensation. So if we do a lift, right, immediately following doing that heavy lift, our performance drops, and then we rest, and then hopefully we don't just come back up to baseline, we come slightly above baseline. That's how adaptation works, right? So it's like the day after you do a workout, you're going to be weaker on that musculature. We give ourselves enough time to recover, and hopefully we see some super compensation past that point. That's basically the premise. So if we're truly training a muscle group or a lift 6 days a week, we kind of are losing that chance to ever see super compensation. But that being said, I believe this is how Matt Venna trains. You can practice a lift 6 days a week. You just can't train it, right? So I'm just creating arbitrary like lingo here, basically just to say that you can practice the motion with very submaximal weights, like very submaximal, not 2 reps away from failure, like 20. True, just technique work. You can do that and incorporate that where it's effectively a rest session for that musculature, so we can still see that super compensation, but we can also get some practice in on the lift, and that can look very light. And then you can perform a lift 6 days a week. I would say that there's no reason to train it, like at least give yourself every other day, right? Give yourself every other day to rest. Maybe don't go SBD 6 days a week, go upper, lower, upper, lower, upper, lower. That way, you know, every other day, your upper body or your lower body day has a chance to recover and hopefully super compensate some amount. I think that it can be done. It absolutely can be done, right? I don't want to come off like this cannot be an effective training split, because Matt Venna is a phenomenal lifter, and I believe this is what he did early in his training career, was very high frequency SBD days, but utilizing more technique focused sessions as a way to manage fatigue. So maybe you have one day where the bench and the squat are quite light, but the deadlift is prioritized and we're truly training it. But I don't think that something of that complexity and that level of specificity is needed for a beginner to get better, right? Let's leave that ultra high specificity training for down the line when you're intermediate or you're advanced and you plateau, right? If we can make good gains benching 2, maybe 3 times a week, let's just ride that wave until that doesn't work anymore, and then switch it over when we need to, right? Like let's say we plateau at 2, we have the option of going to 3 if we can recover from it, and that'll probably get us over that plateau. Let's say we plateau at 3, you've got very good form, very efficient, maybe you have a solid arch, maybe a little wider grip, we go to 4, right? I wouldn't kind of like, you know, lay down your trump card with that super high specificity training right away. I think that the upper lower split probably would be a little bit better suited to what you're doing right now, unless I'm misunderstanding. Please let me know if that's the case. The next one is in a hypertrophy block. Should we be doing something like 8x3 to just be just as effective as 3 sets of 8 for muscle gain? If so, since volume is conserved, wouldn't doing the former be more effective for powerlifting since you're training heavier weights, the same relative effort / RPE in both cases? The only downside would be less time spent doing the sets. Okay, so there's a big discrepancy here. You're saying, okay, yeah, we're performing the same total number of repetitions. Yes. So its volume is equated in that regard. The tonnage of 8 triples at RPE 8 is going to be way higher than 3 sets of 8 at RPE 8. So we're going to do way more tonnage, and we're also, like, if we break down volume and tonnage, one of these is way more taxing than the other. They're not equivalent or exchangeable. And then the other thing is, let's say we quantify volume as hard sets. Well, RPE 8 is a hard set. 8 sets versus 3. Big difference in fatigue here. So you can't keep the RPE equated. What you can do is take the weight that you would do for 3 sets of 8 at 8 and then invert the volume but keep the loading the same, so every single set is submaximal, and give yourself 8 first reps instead of 3 and probably get about the same adaptive response. I think that can be a viable strategy, especially for someone whose first rep is always the worst on something like a deadlift. taking a 3x8, especially because for a lot of people with 3x8, the last couple reps, they're practicing broken down technique, taking the exact weight you would do for that and doing 8 triples instead, maybe on a 1 to 2 minute rest timer, so it takes about the same amount of time, would give you that much more focus on your form because you're doing more first reps. Every set is a little bit more submaximal, so that way we get to think a little bit more and practice our technique and trial and error a little bit more. All at the same time while being probably about similarly fatiguing. We can't fix that RPE and expect them to be the same volume, because it's just not, regardless of how we're quantifying volume other than just working reps. Because working reps isn't an effective way to quantify volume, because working sets from a set of 20 is not the same thing as working sets for a set of 1, right? So that'd be my breakdown. I think it can have its time and place. I don't think that's a practical way necessarily to train the bench press. I don't think that's a practical way to necessarily train the squat, unless you're a walkout. You really need some practice nailing a good walkout, but I do think it's a really good way to train the deadlift for a lot of people who really need to nail in their setup. The next one is, do you think there's any marginal benefits to taking a 30 to 45 minute nap after training for potentially enhanced recovery versus getting that same amount of sleep at night? I know a lot of people can't sleep right after training, but I find that I personally am able to. That's a great question. The science would say that probably if the total sleep is equated, it's about the same. That's everything I've read is familiar with that. But anecdotally, I will tell you that if you can eat a meal and take a nap after training, I genuinely feel that the rate of recovery is significantly better that way. I wouldn't say significantly, noticeably is a better word there. So I would definitely give it a try and see if I think it's worth trying. I think would be the best assessment I could give you. Second to last question. You might have covered this in an old video somewhere, but I was having trouble digging it up. What are your general programming considerations for doing Amraps on the big 3? Okay, so like we talked about earlier, generally speaking, if we are in a hypertrophy phase, I don't believe in Amraps on the big 3, right? Because we could probably get about the same hypertrophy response from maybe 1 maximal set of 8 and 3 sets of 8 at 7. Those are probably roughly-ish going to do about the same thing. And one of those we're drilling good technique, and one of those we might be drilling really shit technique. So I would always favor towards accumulating a little bit more submaximal volume rather than taking your higher rep sets into your failure, unless it's just for fun, and in which case just be careful. So I would never use it in a hypertrophy setting. It can be used in a strength setting, but you have to be an advanced athlete, right? So if you're someone whose form is very variable, doing a max effort set of 5 is every rep's gonna look different. We're gonna drill some bad patterns. And again, that same idea of leaving 1 to 2 in the tank and doing multiple sets of 5 is gonna be better than 1 all-out set of 5. If you are extremely, extremely technically proficient and you can hit an RPE 10 set without a significant amount of breakdown, you've been lifting for a long time, you're really locked in with your technique, then the high intensity, lower volume training can be very viable through a strength and a peaking phase. It is something that I will implement myself, although I will sometimes AMRAP in the higher rep ranges because I think it's fun, not because I think it's effective. But yeah, no, I think that I can get away with maybe implementing that for a set of 5 on something where I'm technically proficient, such as a squat or a bench press, and I can't do that necessarily on the deadlift. So never for hypertrophy phases. If you're very advanced for a strength phase, and then, you know, if we just define AMRAP as many reps as you can do at a weight, you'll probably hit that at some point during your peaking phase. But again, I think unless you're technically proficient, I would still peak out until that final session with 1 in the tank to drill good technique and practice what we're looking to do, and do an extra set or 2, rather than crush yourself with 1 set where your form was bad, and then when you go for the max, it's only going to be worse. So that would be my considerations for it. I hope that's relatively helpful. And then the final question is, when you're programming for someone other than yourself, how do you go about individual difference? Do you start off all the clients in the same general program, assuming all clients have similar training goals, and tweak it from there on account of individual difference? Or do you have some other method for determining an initial training block for a new client? That's a very good question. So how I go about it is it's largely based on demographics, right? So first demographic we're going to look at is like beginner, intermediate, advanced, and that's going to determine, you know, some things about that initial guess that I put out there. It's going to have a lot to do with the initial guess that I put out there. The second thing is how dedicated they are to training. So if someone who is eating in a calorie surplus and nothing but nice clean foods with high micronutrient densities, and they sleep enough, and it's very important for them. They're never going out drinking the night before a big session, or not very often at all. that is going to greatly inform like maybe that total workload versus someone who's like, it's like their 10th priority. They're like, oh yeah, realistically, I go get drunk on the weekends. That's also going to inform kind of my initial volume and frequency prescriptions. Like you said, assuming their goals are the same. So that's one is the like level advanced. 2 is like roughly how serious they are about their recovery variables. 3 would be like men or women. Generally speaking, just the workload that you're going to prescribe for a woman at the same percentage is going to be higher. 4 would be like body size, or I guess almost just as much important as body size is just if they're in good shape or bad shape. You know, generally speaking, super heavyweight guys are in worse shape and lighter guys are in a little bit better shape, but some degree body size, some degree conditioning, because there's some big guys who are in great shape who can handle routines of volume that look roughly like maybe someone much smaller than them. And then the last one that's going to be very important that I would always look at as far as writing that initial prescription as far as frequencies and volumes and whatnot is going to be how strong they are. Absolute tonnage directly is inversely correlated with frequency. You're not going to find someone who's a 1,000-pound deadlifter who pulls heavy twice a week. It's not very viable. I mean, sure, okay, maybe there's an exception. Please let me know if there is. That's super interesting. But pulling heavy once a week is a high frequency for a guy that strength level. Most of the time when you're getting into those just absolute world class, regardless of body weight weights, people are moving to more along the lines of the Lilly Bridge method, where every other week is heavy, and then every other week is a little bit more technique focused, because that's the frequency at which their body was going to respond at those crazy tonnages. And then on the other end of the line, let's say we have a light woman where a 300-pound deadlift is very competitive, she's advanced, you might be looking at maybe even 4 deadlift sessions per week, right? She's also an elite strength athlete, but because that total tonnage is lower, we might be looking at a similar, even though they're similarly advanced, we'd be probably looking at a higher frequency. And a lot of that comes down to just the absolute weight on the bar. So generally speaking, right, like maxes in my training doesn't look crazy different because we're moving kind of similar weights. I recover really well on the bench, so even on the bench it looks similar, even though I out bench max by like 100 pounds. But that would be an exception, not the rule, right? Look at other lifts, right? Julius Maddox only benches heavy once every 10 days or something, right? So the more weight that's on that bar, the lower the frequency. So if someone's exotically strong in a heavyweight class, that'll be one thing. And then if someone's exotically strong in a lightweight class, that'll be another thing. Kind of the same thing as someone's very much a beginner. The amount of working sets they need to do to see adaptation is, you know, you might need to hit, I don't know, throw a number out there, 20 sets of bench. Once your form is good enough that that's not going to hurt you. You might need to hit 20 sets. Also, I'm always very careful about saying bad form, assuming good load selection isn't that dangerous. I don't want to say, oh, if your form's not good, you're going to hurt yourself. If you're pushing really hard and you're inefficient, the chance that we overstress a certain bit of connective tissue or a certain muscle is more likely. So if your form is relatively efficient, but you're a weaker beginner, you might be looking at 20 working sets of bench per week, whereas I might be looking at 4, 5, 6, depending on the phase, right? So it's like, that would be maybe even the biggest singular one. But those would be the variables I look at. Great question. Thank you guys for watching my video. As always, leave a like if you enjoyed it, and I appreciate you guys' support. I really do enjoy making these videos. Thank you.